On April the 14th, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., RMS Titanic, the world's biggest and most luxurious ocean liner, struck an iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic on its maiden voyage. Now, when the Titanic struck the berg, the iceberg opened up the first 6 out of the Titanic's 16 watertight compartments to the sea, and these compartments began to take on water. Or did they? You see, guys, while it is true that the Titanic's first 6 watertight compartments were breached by the iceberg, for some weird reason, the Titanic's first watertight compartment, the one located at the very front of the ship, well, this compartment wasn't really flooding. Some water did get into the compartment, sure, but throughout the early stages of the sinking, this compartment remained mostly completely dry, despite the fact that the compartments behind it were rapidly filling with water. In fact, compartment number 1 remained so dry that it wasn't until the water that was in compartment 2 could begin to spill over the tops of the bulkheads and begin flooding compartment 1 that this compartment filled with water. How could this be? Well, that is what we're going to be taking a look at in today's video. I hope you enjoy. Now, the first thing we need to talk about in order for you all to properly understand why the Titanic's first compartment didn't flood right away is we first need to go over the Titanic's ballast tanks. You see, for those of you who are unaware, large vessels like the Titanic, well, at the bottom of these ships, there are these things called ballast tanks. These tanks can be filled or drained with water, and the purpose of these tanks is to help a vessel like the Titanic maintain stability while she is crossing the Atlantic. So let's say, for example, the Titanic, for whatever reason, develops a slight list to starboard, okay? The ship is leaning to starboard. So what the Titanic's crew can do is they can flood the ballast tanks on the opposite side of the ship, so the port side, and then by doing that, they could add additional weight to that side, and thus it would bring the ship back to more or less an even keel. This is, in a nutshell, what ballast tanks are. Now, the reason why we need to talk about this in order for you to properly understand why the first compartment didn't flood right away is we need to talk about one tank in particular that was part of the Titanic's ballast tank system. That tank is called the forepeak tank, and it was located at the very front of the Titanic within the first watertight compartment. Now, the purpose of the forepeak tank was just like all the other tanks that were part of the Titanic's ballast tank network, to help the Titanic maintain stability while the ship was at sea. Now, the thing you need to understand about the forepeak tank is it was quite large. It occupied the entire bottommost deck of the Titanic's first watertight compartment, the tank top. And it was actually quite tall as well. In fact, it was so tall that it almost reached the next deck above the tank top, which was called the orlop deck. Now, when I was looking at the Titanic's plans, I noticed that the space on the Titanic that was at the top of where the forepeak tank was at, well, it seems like they called this part of the ship the lower orlop deck. But from what I could find, it seems like they only called the space directly above the forepeak tank the lower orlop deck and no other parts of the Titanic. So now I'm sure all of you are thinking, okay, all of this about the Titanic's ballast tanks is interesting, but what does this have to do with why the Titanic's first watertight compartment really didn't flood right away? Well, I'll tell you. So remember how earlier in this video I said that the forepeak tank was actually quite tall? You know, it almost went from the tank top deck up to the orlop deck. Well, when the Titanic struck the iceberg and the first watertight compartment was breached, well, it was only breached in the area of the forepeak tank. And it was the forepeak tank itself that was breached, not the space above it. So as water began to make its way inside the forepeak tank, well, when the forepeak tank was completely filled with water, the water then had no way to move from the forepeak tank to the space above it. This is why the Titanic's first watertight compartment really didn't flood all that much right after the iceberg impact. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking right now, wait a minute, how do we know for certain that it was just the forepeak tank that was breached and not the rest of the first watertight compartment? Well, for that, we have to thank the testimony of one crew member in particular. He was a lamp trimmer by the name of Samuel Hemmings, and he was in the area of the first compartment at the time of the iceberg impact. You see, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, Samuel Hemmings was in his bunk, located near the front of the Titanic. And because he was so far forward, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, he felt the impact pretty strongly. The impact woke him up, so he quickly jumped out of his bunk and ran over to a porthole to try to take a look outside to see if he could see what the Titanic had hit, because he knew from the impact he felt that the Titanic hit something. Now, he didn't see anything outside, but while he was looking, he did notice that he could hear a strange sound coming from somewhere behind him. He described it as a hissing sound, and he said it was pretty loud. So he decided to go and investigate this sound to see if he could figure out where it was coming from. Now, Samuel Hemmings knew that typically whenever you hear a hissing sound coming from somewhere within a vessel, that usually means that wherever the sound is coming from, well, water is most likely rapidly flooding that area. And the hissing sound is generated because as water rapidly floods an area of a ship, it forces the air out, and this is what causes that hissing sound. Now, Samuel grew closer and closer to the source of the sound. He was expecting to find water everywhere. Eventually, he reached the top of the forepeak tank, and he was surprised to discover that that entire area was completely dry. There wasn't a drop of water to be found anywhere. However, he could still hear the sound, and it was extremely loud. Eventually, he figured out that the sound was coming from this exhaust pipe that was connected to the forepeak tank. You see, if the Titanic's crew ever accidentally overfilled the forepeak tank, well, they used the exhaust pipe to, safely expel the water, get it off of the ship. And because the forepeak tank was now flooding with water from the ocean, well, as the water rapidly filled the tank, it was forcing the air out of the tank, and the air was escaping through this exhaust pipe. And this is why Samuel Hemmings heard that really loud hissing sound. Not long after Samuel found the source of the sound, Chief Officer Henry Wilde showed up because he was doing his own damage inspection of the Titanic. Henry Wilde also heard the strange hissing sound, so he asked Samuel about it. Samuel told him everything he knew about the forepeak tank, the exhaust pipe, and so on and so forth. Henry Wilde then asked him if there was any more water seen in the first watertight compartment, above the forepeak tank. And Samuel told Henry Wilde that everything above the tank was completely dry. Henry Wilde said thank you, and then he headed back up to the boat deck. So yeah, guys, with that, now all of you watching this video now know why the Titanic's first watertight compartment really didn't flood all that much, with the exception of the forepeak tank, immediately following the iceberg collision. And in fact, most of this compartment remained completely dry until the water that was in the second watertight compartment was able to reach the top of the bulkhead separating compartment 2 from compartment 1 and began to spill over into the first compartment. And guys, while this information really doesn't change our understanding of how the Titanic sank too much, it is always interesting to discover the really unique ways that the flooding of the Titanic progressed, because the way the Titanic flooded was very unique when you compare the sinking of the Titanic to other ships. The water did a lot of weird stuff, and there's a lot of variables to consider. Another example is how the water moved through the ship through Scotland Road on E deck. That's an interesting variable. How extra water got into the ship through the D deck gangway door because Lightoller opened that. That's another interesting variable. But yeah, my point is the flooding of the Titanic was very unusual, and it's always interesting to discover a new thing about how the water progressed through the ship. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave it a like. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Special thanks to Titanic Honor and Glory for providing the sinking animation you saw in today's video. Please check out their work in the description below. Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.